Hey guys, this is Lucas from Better Coding Academy, and in this video I thought I'd do something a little bit different to some of the videos I've done before in the past. In a lot of videos in the past, I normally go with an approach where I'd take a problem or I'd take a thing I want to build, I'd think about it, I'd put code together, I'd kind of tinker on it, sometimes for a couple of hours ahead of time, and then from there I'd take that in front of the camera, in front of my screen, and then I'd put it back together for you. But in this video, I'm approaching this question without having any code actually written for it, and I want to make sure that I want to try and convey more of my thought process. I want to do a little bit less editing on these kinds of videos just to show how I actually go through a problem like this, and maybe perhaps from the perspective of an interview, how I'd approach a question that I showcase, and then how we can kind of work through it together. And if you have any questions or any bit of feedback, you can leave it in the comments below, and I'll be happy to read about it, and then we can talk about that as well. But this is my question for today, so let's jump into it. This one is about designing a reusable table in React. And the idea here is, well, let me first read out the question. So how would you design a reusable table in React? What features will you support? And be sure to consider legibility, reusability, and performance. So this in particular here, before I kind of jump into it, this is a type of interview question that really makes you think about a lot of things and really puts your experience on the table, right? Because when you have a question like this, there's no real correct answer, right? It's pretty obvious that something like this is meant to evoke thought. It's meant to get you to think more deeply about the problem and about what we're trying to get out of it. And, so like what features will you support and what considerations will you put in mind? So a lot of it really comes from your past experiences and taking them forward and being able to convey them to the interviewer or to, whoever's reviewing your code or whatever. And also, any decisions that you make need to be kind of guided by that, so that when you do have the table at the end of the day, or when you do have something put together, that you have considered these things very carefully, and that there is a good reason and motivation and intentionality behind the decisions that you make. But let's kind of jump into it. And before I go into the code, let me first, I guess, talk through what I see as a table. So a table is, it's there to display very tabular data, and the typical HTML syntax for that is, you have your tables, you have your, your rows and your TDs and your columns, right? So like this type of data is displayed from a particular data set. So usually when we have tabular data, or when we have a table, it's commonly referred to as tabular data. So it's referred to something which is coming from a source, and usually you have it in some form of maybe an array of objects. So then the reason you have an array of objects is then each object inside of that array acts as a row, and then each property within that object could act as a column. It could be metadata for another column. It kind of is structured in that way specifically to work well and be rendered well within the table. So with all of this in mind, we need to consider that angle when we talk about what exactly is a reusable table. So when we talk about what we're looking for, beyond just a table TRTD, what is it that we want to support? And what is it also that, in terms of what we want to support, what is it that as a developer we are looking for? Because when we talk about designing something that's reusable in terms of code, our end user are people like us, right? Our end user are other developers. Maybe if it's part of a library, it's people consuming that library. And we need to ask ourselves, what are we looking to get out of it, right? What do they want to have inside of this table? And how do we support those features? And, later down the track, if we want to add more features, how do we support those as well? So these are all of the kinds of questions that I'm considering when I look at something like this. It's not just let's jump into the code and let's write something, but a really good seniorish approach is to take a step back and to say, okay, now from here, we're talking about building this table, and we're talking about putting something together which is, I guess, quite reusable. Then what are the core tenets and core principles that we have to keep in mind when we look at something like this? So before we kind of jump into things any further, it's always also a good idea, where it's allowed and where you have an understanding of this, to look at existing implementations, or to look at things which are kind of related to what we already have. So for something like this, I might, I've been looking a lot at Blueprint.js, if you've seen my recent videos, and they do have some form of table implementation. For Blueprint in particular, it's quite interesting because they don't only have one type of representation for tabular data. They actually have two. So let's first have a look at this table, but let's not go there first. Let's actually look at core. And inside of core, you realize they have HTML table. Now, they make it very clear that this is not blueprint.js/table. This is a simple, I want to highlight this part here. This is a simple CSS only skin for HTML table elements. I think of this as being really important to understand because that kind of highlights a deeper thing, is that Blueprint.js here has two tables. They have one which is more for basic static tables, and their other one actually is more akin to a spreadsheet, but we'll kind of look at that and we'll look at their implementation of that, and we can kind of talk about why they did that as well. But firstly, with the HTML table, they have a few things here. You notice they have different props, bordered, condensed, element ref, interactive, small, striped. With the exception of element ref, which I guess is more like, just when you have a reusable component, when you have something like element ref or input ref, or if it's done using forward ref, it might just be the ref prop. You usually have this to enable like a generic set of functionality which might extend, in the form of some other library. So just kind of, without regarding this one in particular, everything else here is very much focused on styling. You see, so this one has borders, this one is a condensed appearance, this one is interactive around hover styles. This one is a condensed appearance again, but this one's been deprecated. I presume they mean use this now, and also a striped. So I guess this kind of is also very similar to the table in Twitter Bootstrap, which has very much similar things as well. So we can actually take a look at that as well. Even though Twitter Bootstrap's not strictly React, we can look at their React implementation as well. But let's have a look at their table. I haven't been to this site in a long time. It looks very different. But they have very similar things. So they have a table, they have different styling for the rows, they have striped tables as well, they have hoverable rows, so kind of like interactive, I guess, and they have active as well. You can kind of highlight a particular one, and there's also a condensed one, if I'm pretty sure there is, small tables. Yeah, so they have the kind of condensed look as well. So you notice that both of these libraries here have something in common. And from my point of view, once again, before jumping into it, it really makes me think then they must have a point as to why they do things this way. And I guess from my point of view then is the question becomes, why do they do it this way? And what can we learn from that? And is it in line with what we are trying to do? If so, let's do something similar. If not, let's take a different approach, but let's take that different approach very intentionally. So when you look at someone else doing something, right, and you might say, okay, well, they're doing it, therefore we should do it. But I would kind of insist that we take that question one layer further to say, instead of saying they're doing it, we should also do it, we should say they're doing it. What is the semantics, or what is the reason behind them doing it that certain way? And does that reason align with our reasons? And does that reason align with our motives? And if that does, then we have a very good reason for doing it that way. On the other hand, if it doesn't, for example, if we wanted to support very spreadsheet-like data, then in that situation, we can confidently say that this is not the approach we want to go, and that instead we want to follow this other approach because that is more in line with what we're trying to do. With all of that said, let's kind of have a bit of a look through. So you have these kind of different styles, and maybe this is what we want to go for. I'm not going to make a decision on that just yet. I want to spend a little bit more time kind of running through the backdrop that I personally take when I look at a question like this. So this is a table implementation that exists. Let's also have a look at their blueprint table. So this one is a highly interactive table component, which is, obviously at contrast with what they said before, which is this one, a CSS only scheme. So keep that in mind as well, right? We look at this table here, and this one has columns defined actually. So it doesn't define them as rows, but defines them as columns, which is interesting. And you get something like this, which is pretty cool, right? It kind of, looks like Excel, I guess you could say. It has that type of, structure there, and you can render these different values within the cells. So this is, definitely very different and very interesting, right? Let's see if we can see any other examples. And see this one here, you've got a lot more records, and let's see if we can sort ascending, and you can sort descending. My computer's a bit slow, but it still is working quite well. So you've got this whole thing going on here, and that obviously is a very interesting piece of functionality as well. So now let's kind of take a step back and see what is it we are trying to do. So this question says, design a reusable table. It doesn't say to go for, the data type version. And it doesn't say to go for the CSS style. The one in Blueprint.js, this like kind of blueprint table, spreadsheet like one, actually reminds me of, I think it's React Data Grid. And this one, where is it? There was a component for it, but I don't know which one it was. I don't think it was the Material UI one, but let me have a look at this one as well. Right, so this one here is yet again kind of different. So it has, it's got checkboxes here, and we can look at the source code. So it's got checkbox selection as part of it built in, disable selection on click. So this one's obviously very focused around working with individual rows and being able to manipulate data. So you might be thinking of, some sort of like admin dashboard type scenario, like a control panel where you have these individual rows or individual records, and then you can say, okay, I want to edit this one in particular, or I want to delete this one, and this might be the way you do that. So this kind of gives me that kind of vibe. It also does have, pagination built in as well. So these are all things that we can do, and this is a direction in which we can take it. So that's another approach we can go for. Coming back to this question again, and I know I've kind of gone on a few different tangents, and just to show a few different things out there, is to summarize, I think that we can kind of look at it in two basic angles. One angle here is we can go with something which is very tightly integrated. And what I mean by that is, for example, like the data grid here in Material UI. Alternatively, kind of similar to the Blueprint.js table as well, as opposed to the HTML table. So the HTML table I would call, a lot looser, a lot less integrated, whereas something like like this table here is a lot more integrated. And the reason I say that is because when we code it up, we don't define the individual rows, we don't define the cells specifically, we define it declaratively. So for example, this code here, we pass in a certain amount of data, and then what happens is, in this case, we're actually using the row index. So we're not even passing in data. Like this is literally all the code needed to render this, right? When we look at something like this, we don't actually see just the table, but we see a lot of things around the table that have been implemented to make certain things easier to do. It's optimized towards a certain path. And in this case, that path might be, building some sort of spreadsheet like data. So perhaps, you're building something to view, I guess, more raw data, like say, for example, maybe you're building a data warehouse, maybe you're building like an online database or something like, Airtable might be, more similar to this. But then you also have the very much, I guess, kind of light approach where there isn't much integration. It's very loose on how we look at it. And it might be something like this. So you have to define the T head, the TR, the TH. And I'm well aware that this is obviously not written in React specifically, but obviously, you can apply this to React code as well. And this gives you a lot more control, right? You can say, okay, I'm going to do cold span on this particular row, or I'm going to add a checkbox in this particular section. I'm going to be putting it together in a specific way. I'm going to style this particular TD. And that's not something that you can easily do when your approach is a lot more integrated like this, or alternatively like that, right? So this is kind of like broadly the two approaches we can go for. When you have a very integrated approach, you get a lot of features out of the box, and you get a lot of things in a very particular, you get a lot of things optimized for a very particular feature set and for a particular business function or business purpose. Whereas if you go for something that is a lot more open, a lot more flexible, you don't really have that. You might have some stuff like styles, but in general, it means that you have to do a lot more of the kind of bootstrapping type work or the boilerplate type work to make it happen on top of just simply the code that you have and on top of what you've put together. So it really is a trade-off here that I think, in this case with this question, it's worth thinking about that. And it's worth making that clear before you jump into saying, okay, we're going to go and create something like this, or we're going to create something like this, or we're going to, give people a lot of flexibility and create something like this, without really looking at the context behind it. And I know I've been going on for like 15 minutes now talking about these different things, but I think it's really important to understand that and have that context before you start to say, okay, we're going to go for this particular approach or that particular approach. With all of that said though, at this point, it might be kind of, if you are doing this in an interview, you might kind of produce or convey a very brief version of that to your interviewer. Might not be good to spend 15 minutes talking through all of that, but then from there you might ask them like, what is it that we're looking for? What kind of table are we looking to support? Alternatively, they might let you make the call, right? They might say, okay, well, pick one and let's build something like that. Let's talk about features within a certain one of these tables, and let's think about how we're going to implement those in particular. In our case here, what I'm thinking is let's do something that is a little bit of a combination of both. And this, I think, is more around giving us the flexibility to style it however we want, put in different TDs however we want, but also have some degree of structure and some degree of reusability so that we can do things like, for example, pagination, like this, or selecting rows like that. How can we do both in a way that doesn't overly optimize in one way or another, and gives us enough flexibility to kind of work with both? And from my point of view, I think something like that is actually really interesting. And you can find something similar to it in the form of a React table. So this one, React table tan stack, this one here is not overly prescriptive regarding the type of structure that you have. It actually uses a hook space approach. So what that means is that, when we look at the code for this, and there's a lot of props and a lot of different stuff, and we don't need to implement all of that. But if we have a look at, one of their examples here, you'll notice that the actual table itself is, you render the table. So you write the stuff for the table, but they also provide you with a lot of stuff around, for example, the different props being passed into the tr, th, what that means, what exactly you put in every single row, the reason you do that. There's a lot of functionality around that, right? So we can look at, for example, use row select, and we might be able to see an example for that. So let's just say checks current pages rows, because I think that's pretty cool. For example, in this one here, if we just close these messages here, my computer's lagging, and we have something like this, and my face is kind of blocking it, but we can do stuff like that, which is pretty cool, right? And we can also do pagination, which is also pretty cool. But then all of this is done with our own table. So this is our table here. But we also are able to kind of, render these checkboxes, render the things that they're providing. And it also has like a kind of different layout here, which is pretty cool, right? And all of that is provided via the use table hook and a whole bunch of configuration around that. So I think this is really interesting, right? Because this kind of shows how we might potentially do a more of a third approach, which kind of unifies the first two, takes a little bit of that, built-in kind of implied type of logic in the form of like, how we're going to be rendering our table. So kind of akin to what we have with the data grid, but also gives us obviously a lot of flexibility on how we style, on how we construct our table, on the structure and all that kind of stuff. It gives us a lot of that fine-grained control as well. So having both of those there, I think is a very interesting concept. In this particular case, I'm going to be showing that in today's video. So I'm going to demonstrate how I might build something like that out and put something like that together. There really is no reason why I'm going for the third approach as opposed to one of the first two. You probably could justify either any one of those three approaches. But in an interview, it's probably best to ask and say, how should we progress? Or what types of features are we supporting? This question here has been left very open-ended to say what features will you support, but I guess if you kind of go into companies like Meeting Room or nowadays mostly online, and you're doing this interview question, then you might ask the question, how are we using this within the company, and then what features will that support, and also what tables already exist. So if there's already something which is very much opinionated, are we just looking for something that can style it, or vice versa? And I think these are all very valid questions that need to be asked.